Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, today is it's an anniversary of sorts. It was 3 years ago, January 30th, 2021, a few weeks after I turned 50, that I got inspired by the double whammy of watching Derek DelGaudio's special in and of itself and the first episode of John Lurie's HBO show, Painting with John, and went outside with a pencil and a sketch pad to try to draw some of the big trees in my backyard. The results, which I have talked about before on this show, look like they were drawn by a stroke victim who's just trying to regain use of his hands, but they got better. I got better. For the longest time, I was drawing daily, but in late 2022, I kind of fell off of that habit for a variety of reasons. But I still draw, occasionally paint, not as often. But the whole thing taught me to see the world very, very differently than I had been. And it rewired my brain in some really glorious ways. So that's an anniversary I'm going to celebrate. Maybe after this, I'll go out in the yard, try and draw the trees again. We're also a few weeks away from the 12th anniversary of my first podcast conversation. That was February 23rd, 2012. I will find a way to celebrate that too. But for now, let's dive into this week's show. My guest this time is Elizabeth Flock, or Liz as we'll call her throughout this, who has an amazing new book out called The Furies, Women, Vengeance, and Justice, published by Harper. Came out a few weeks ago. It's January 2024 for you time travelers out there. The Furies explores what happens when women fight violence with violence. And Elizabeth reports on 3 very different cases over the course of the book. A woman in rural Alabama who was raped, shoots her attacker and has to face the criminal justice system. A low-caste woman in northern India who responds to some property violence by forming a gang of women to fight back against injustice, and that grows, and the definition of injustice grows with it. And then a young Syrian Kurd who joins the YPJ to fight ISIS and to try to build a Kurdish autonomous zone or nation, or we'll go with autonomous zone. But through their stories and the lives that these 3 women touch, Elizabeth offers up this amazing narrative about what happens when women are pushed too far and the institutions around them break down. Or, as she points out, when those institutions work exactly as they're designed to. The first chapter goes into some awful details about the criminal justice system in the U.S. and how stand your ground only works for some people and not others. But all 3 chapters really show a world that's built to grind people down, especially women. And Liz's writing and her reporting are top-notch. I mean, the Furies will sweep you along through each of their stories, even as the range extends farther and farther from what we'll say is a comfortable Northeastern American perspective. I was floored by this book and just amazed at how deftly Liz was able to bring these women's stories to light while avoiding hagiography. As she says in our conversation, the deeper she got, the more complicated and muddy each of these stories became. And it's to her credit that it's warts and all. This doesn't simply become a book about female empowerment, but one where cultures of honor really wreak destruction on everyone, women and men. And we see that even when there's change, it can be too easy to just kind of replicate the same power dynamics. I don't know. The Furies, it's a powerful and harrowing book, and it tells us an awful lot about human behavior and the institutions we built or that we inherit to protect privilege. And the women who Liz profiles, they're put in positions no one should have to be in. And she leaves us in full knowledge that we are in no position to judge what each of them do or did. This is, well, let me just say past and future podcast, Lance Richardson connected me with Liz, and I'm really thankful to him for doing that. I know I would not have come across this book on my own, but now that I've read it, it's going to stick with me for a long time. So go get The Furies, Women, Vengeance, and Justice by Elizabeth Flock. It's a fantastic book, and one that I'm really glad I get to share with other people. Now, here's Elizabeth's bio. Elizabeth Flock is an Emmy Award-winning journalist whose work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, and on PBS NewsHour and Netflix, among other outlets. She is the host of Blind Plea, a podcast from Lemonada Media about criminalized survival. Her reporting is supported by the Pulitzer Center, PEN America, and the International Women's Media Foundation. Her first book, The Heart is a Shifting Sea, won a Nautilus Book Award for books that inspire and make a difference. She lives in Chicago and Los Angeles. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Elizabeth Flock. How did The Furies begin, and how did it evolve from what you first envisioned?
Yeah, so I have worked as a journalist for a long time, and when I started writing longer form stuff, I realized that a lot of times I pursue stories that are personal quests in a way. But yeah, I guess over the years, I found myself obsessed with vigilante stories, as many of us are in our pop culture, whether it was movies like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo or songs like Goodbye Earl by Dixie Chicks. There were all these kind of dark stories about heroes that were actually anti-heroes, and women fighting back. And I started to wonder why I was so interested in these stories. And I think it's because I've experienced sexual violence like a lot of other women have. And I realized I kind of wished that I could be them. And I think a lot of us do wish when whether we're watching like a Marvel movie or watching a female vigilante movie, like we wish we could be these heroes or heroines. And then as a journalist, I started wondering, are there real life versions of these women who are fighting back, who are heroes or heroines who are maybe crossing the line as well? And so I went looking for them. And that's how this project began. And
what did it turn into? Because actually, let me jump in. Being a man, I'm going to mansplain something. I went in thinking it was. Thank you. And I feel terrible throughout this entire podcast. So that's just how this will go. No. But I went in thinking it was going to be instances like the first part of the book, namely women suffering sexual violence, attacking or getting retribution on their attacker. And you explore something a lot more subtle and different because you move beyond, I'll say just the instance of a woman being raped into other forms of violence that women undergo, and these much broader responses that some of your subjects had for it. So yeah, how did that end up growing from what your first thought was?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to look at women who use violence to fight against violence in different contexts. So it would have been one kind of project, and probably a very dark and depressing one, just to look at women who fought back against their abusers in the US, of which there are unfortunately many, many stories. But I also wanted to look at women who were fighting back against other things and just try to understand, like, if we're violently fighting back against violence, is this helpful? Is this harmful? And I kind of just let that question lead me wherever I could find women who were doing that around the world. So I actually knew from the beginning that I wanted to write about a woman in the YPJ in Syria, which is an all-female militia that took up arms on behalf of the Kurds, but also for gender equality. And they fought ISIS and actually were the main force that were responsible for vanquishing ISIS. And a lot of people don't even know that. But I just was like, why are these women, like, who are 16, 17, 18, picking up Kalashnikovs and desperate to fight? And some of it had to do with gender-based violence because ISIS was, raping and killing a lot of women there, but there was also other reasons. And then, my reporting also led me to India to report on a female vigilante gang there who was taking on domestic abusers, but they were also taking on men who cheated on their wives and even sometimes fighting back against other women. So it all just, the longer I worked on this project, the more complicated and muddy it grew, which as a journalist is both wonderful and a nightmare because it just becomes more and more messy the further you go. But I think that was what was also really cool about this project is there are no easy answers.
Yeah, can you talk a little about that? How it how it got muddied? Because there are things in there. You show how the counter revolutions and institutions get as messed up as the ones they're fighting against. But how much of that were you expecting going in, I guess, versus what the reality turned out to be?
I mean, I feel like anytime you spend years on a project, it always gets messier. But I will say I was a little bit starry-eyed about this one. And I thought, wow, cool. There's like this female vigilante gang in India taking on domestic abusers. And like, that's pretty incredible. And then, of course, I go there and then I realize the leader of the gang, she's actually becoming corrupted by politics. And then she starts bragging to me about having beaten up a young girl who left her husband for another man. And it all just starts to become messier and messier. And, in Syria, too, that was all part of the Kurdish revolution. But, I think I write at one point that there's always a time in a utopia where things start to go awry. And I saw that happen there, too. And so, but I realized like it's possible for these women to both be heroines and anti-heroes. Like it's possible for Angori, the leader of the Green Gang in India, to swing her, canes at domestic abusers and get men to stop being abusive for like the first time in decades. But also for her to make decisions that I think a lot of us would find really troubling and unsettling. And I wanted people to wrestle with that. Like as you're reading, how do I even feel about this person? Like, do I think she should keep doing what she's doing? Do I think this is like all wrong? And, there were activists who thought, women's rights activists who didn't like what they were doing and felt like two wrongs don't make a right, like an eye for an eye never works. But then, and I would leave that interview with that activist being like, yeah, this is messed up. And then I would talk to the women in the Green Gang and they'd say, if it wasn't for the Green Gang, I would be dead. And I don't know how you argue with that statement, So
it was very much, and you very much put us in that, again, even as a guy, it puts you in that position of, yeah, but what would I be doing if I was in this position? What would I be, be able to handle this purely, or would I also end up trying to figure out that, how to make something in the imminent world while trying to make this big change on a larger scale for the women around her. How difficult was it, I guess, to really not just understand the people, but the differences in cultures from what we're accustomed to, what you're accustomed to in a certain liberal aspect of the U.S. to something in Alabama, and then beyond that into northern India and what we'll call Kurdistan, understanding just how the cultures differed and where they overlap with ours.
Yeah. I mean, I think I followed wherever I could find women that were fighting back and using violence against violence. And I happened to focus on 3 places that I realized all had cultures of honor, where the word honor kept coming up again and again. So whether it was the woman I followed in rural Alabama or northern India or Kurdish Syria, the men constantly used the word honor and the women talked about honor. And I realized that I think was motivating a lot of the violence that the women faced. And I mean, some of us have probably heard of like honor killings where a woman is killed for, doing something that, upsets her family honor. And that might seem really far away, like that happens in India or maybe even Syria. But, even in rural Alabama, the woman that I wrote about, a lot of the men in that town felt like they had to fight to protect their honor and were constantly getting into like really extreme fist fights. And I read a whole book about culture of honor in the South and how, I think that I realized like the reason that I kept landing in these different places, like as different as these cultures may seem to be, cultures of honor exist everywhere and are deeply tied with like patriarchal cultures. And it's really as messed up for the men as it is for the women, because men who feel like they have to defend their honor are constantly on the back foot and constantly feeling vulnerable. And I think exercise their power in really messed up ways and, are violent against women. And then the women are violent in response. And so that was something that I think was surprising, but yeah, certainly, making myself an expert in Kurdish Syria took years and was not an easy feat. I knew about India because I'd reported there before
Sure.
That was actually my first job was in India, but going to Kurdish Syria and reporting on it, I mean, I read probably 100 books and it's the Middle East. It's extremely complicated. Anyone who pretends to be an expert in any region there is probably lying. So it was definitely difficult. I'm not going to lie.
And when it came to the real reporting aspect of it, how tough was it to parse myth? I'll say myth instead of lying. Myth from fact. I mean, you talk a little about the Angori, particularly in her case, but for all three of these, there's a sense of mythos or self-deception in some respects. And how challenging was that for you to puncture, to get across to the reader without mythologizing your subjects, I guess.
Yeah.
Knowing that the Furies themselves are subject to myth. But
right. Yeah. I mean, Angori was the most difficult and probably is, I think the studies of the other two women are a lot more intimate. And part of that reason that Angori is told a little more of a distance is because she self-mythologized so much and she was never willing to break that self-mythologizing with me. And she really was invested in her own story. And I think she knew that her survival depended on the mythology that she sort of told about herself. And, she had created the story of herself and a lot of it was true, but she was also, she told me at one point that her gang had 14,000 members and there was no way for me to verify that because the gang itself was all word of mouth. No one has phones. Like it was, hundreds upon hundreds of villages that I would have had to visit. So, but I didn't think that they had 14,000 members, but her success depended, because a lot of times she was fighting against the local cops, depended on the cops thinking she had 14,000 members. So it was really hard to definitely, as you said, puncture that self-mythologizing that went on. And I think with Angori, it was the hardest. I remember when I got there, 10 days into my stay, she said she couldn't meet me one morning. And I was like, well, why not? And she said, oh, I just have something to do. And then I drove down the street and I see a giant billboard with her face on it. And I see that there's a political event being held and hosted by her that day that she said she could not meet. And she was trying to hide that from me. Even though there was a massive billboard in town advertising it. So it's that was the level of, mythologizing that she was doing. And also she wanted to tell a very specific story to me, probably as a Western journalist, and didn't want me to know that she was entering politics because that would be corrupt. And she would know that I would think that that was the case. And ultimately she invited me to the event and I went, it was fine. But, there was a world in which I didn't go to that event and would not have known that that was a whole layer of who she was.
Yeah, and then get, we'll say, discredited or punctured when the book comes out and people say, oh, you didn't know her at all. But,
right.
But yeah, no, you really convey the mixed The mixed feelings and the complication as you bring up in what this stuff, the good that comes out of it. Because again, it seems, especially in that middle chapter, the sense that this was giving women a voice in a particular culture where they're just not expected to in the slightest. So you get across the good while you're showing that in practice there were some, not so good activities that were tied into it. But what I appreciated, and it'll sound weird, was largely keeping yourself out of the story.
Yeah.
Like you're there, you're reporting, but you're not over inserting the Liz, I guess. How much of a conscious decision was that? Or do you feel that was the case in the book?
Yeah, that was definitely conscious. I mean, I don't like writing in the first person. I never have. I'm a journalist. And I also feel like especially when writing about cultures that are not my own, I don't really want to add in a ton of my own feelings and takeaways. I'd rather let my subjects speak for themselves as much as possible. But and in order to not cast judgment as well, like I really wanted to just tell these stories as they were without telling the reader how to feel about them, and just tell you the story of Angori beating up a young girl and then have you decide how to feel about it and not have my take on that. But I did write in the first person for the prologue and the epilogue of the book. And some people have said like, oh, I wanted a lot more, but I think I'd rather these stories tell themselves. I did in the author's note at the beginning, I did share my own story of sexual violence. And that was something I actually really did not want to do, but I felt like I kind of want people to know that there is an origin story for this book. And even if it makes me sound like less than objective, like I don't really think journalists are objective. I think we just pretend to be. So I'd rather be upfront about my starting place than try to obscure it. I
felt it was a really effective way to begin. I thought it really sets the tone, not just in terms of the violence, but your reaction afterwards, which again is the theme of the whole book. How women either take up arms or don't, but what that urge is like.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I felt like, okay, there's a version of this where I sound kind of unhinged because I say like I was roofied and raped in Rome in my 20s. And then I thought about wishing that I had a gun or a knife to fight back against this guy, and later wanting to set, his house on fire. Or his furniture shop on fire. And, I think the reality is that all of us have thoughts like that about people who have harmed us.
Guys are like that all the time. Guys are always doing this sort of macho, ooh, yeah, I could win. Not in the Scott Adams, every man is constantly on operational security. But yeah, we always have this guy, if I had to defend myself on this airplane, everything turns into Air Force One.
Right. So I was just like, let me lay it all out there.
Yeah. And again, I think it really sets the tone throughout. It raises a question. It's something I've had on and off on the show for years now. The difference between vengeance and justice. And it's really something that carries over through the first two, especially with Syria. Things get really weird in your book, but that I think is part of Syria. Like you say, it's not the protagonist is not responding to direct violence against herself. She is taking up arms for something different. And what she's trying to build, or what she hopes to be part of, is, a different idea of what society can be. Yeah. And you capture, what those ideas are and how in practice, in this incredibly beleaguered environment in which it's trying to come into practice, it has its share of like you say, the flaws that go wrong in utopia. But yeah, that one, it's again, three very different chapters and three very different conceptions of what revenge is and what justice is, and how we see each of those people change under the circumstances and under themselves. But I'm telling your book for you.
No, I'm interested to know. I mean, yeah, I think I could have picked 3 stories that were more similar, but I think I just really wanted to know like why women take up arms and all of these different reasons. And there was like gender-based violence in all 3 of these stories. Like there is domestic and sexual abuse happening in Alabama, India, and Syria. But in all 3 of the stories, there was like another layer as well, which is like in Alabama, Brittany was also poor and as a result didn't have good legal representation. And in India, Angori was also low caste and she was also being discriminated against for that. And so were many other women. And in Syria, Chichek, the fighter, was also a Kurd and was being discriminated for that. So it's, all these layers of vulnerability that cause someone to fight back. It's not just because you're a woman. It's like, and I think like, I hope that this book, that men read it too, because it's really not just about women fighting back against abuse. It's also about like all the ways that all of us are vulnerable and what any of us would do when violence happens against us, and like what is considered self-defense. Like what is self-defense? Like you said, what is vengeance and what is justice? What is self-defense and what is retaliation? Like where is that line?
I would say you're even answering or asking the question of what is violence. Because it's not sometimes, again, it's not that immediate one-on-one threat. And you really convey that both in terms of the war and just what it's like to have all the cards stacked against you. How's the reception of the book been so far?
It's been really interesting. I'm on the book tour right now, and I think the in-person conversations have been the best. And
Fine.
I think
I'm just kidding. I know we could have gotten together next week, but I'm thankful we're doing this now. So.
Yeah. I appreciate that, since I told Gil I have a 5-month baby and it makes every part of this a little bit more difficult. But no, I mean, I thought it was interesting. In Chicago, I did an event and a Palestinian mother and daughter came and they wanted to know, and the person I was doing it in conversation did too, about the connection between the book and what's happening in Gaza with Israel and Palestine. And, these questions about self-defense extend far beyond just the women in this book. So I felt like that was really interesting that people were taking it there. And yeah, a lot of women have reached out to me and said like, hey, you're telling a story that is my story. And so I didn't write this book, just for critics or reviews. It's like, I really wrote this truly for women who defended themselves or wished they had, or for any of us who maybe froze in the moment that we wish we could have defended ourselves, and just for all of us asking these questions. So it's been really cool to see it resonate with people in all these different ways.
And I know it's a massively terrible question to ask, especially since there's a number of other life things that occurred during it. But how different are you from the Liz who began this book?
Oh, I'm really different. I mean, when I was reporting this book, I had so many mental breakdowns. I can't even tell you. And actually, I wanted to write the book mostly about Alabama, and my editor at the time would not let me because she thought it would be like really unhealthy for me mentally. And I have learned how to establish some boundaries with a lot of this content, which can be really dark. And I think the book helped in that way, because this is a book about people having agency. It's not a book about, look at these victims who are just gone through this extreme violence and all the horrible things that have happened to them. It's a book about what happens after that, and women who do seize agency and what that looks like. And, I became a mom during this time. So I have a 5-month-old baby, and I think it's sort of cliche to say, but I am a little less angry and a little more focused on building. And so that has been a weird and helpful metamorphosis that I've undergone in the last year. And I think I have, when you're younger, you're full of rage, but also full of like thinking the answers. And if this book taught me anything, and if being a mom has taught me anything, it's how little I actually know and how many more questions I have. So
yeah, well, wait till the kid starts talking.
I know, right? I know nothing is the real answer.
I hope this isn't too personal a question to ask, and we can edit it out, but was the decision to have a kid after the book a I'm going to have a kid after this book, or, more of a sort of amorphous, this is something that is happening in my life now?
Oh no, I wish that I was that intentional about life, but I'm quite headlong in terms of the way I do things. No, it happened to work out okay that I was finishing the book while pregnant, but even that was really hard. The editing process was really hard because I was super pregnant and super sick, and I was also hosting a podcast where I could barely talk because, they're pressing up against your lungs when you're so pregnant, and
God.
It was just a lot. So no, this is not well planned, but I feel like it's pretty cool to have him along on this adventure now that I'm sharing this book with the world. But yeah, you just deal with life as it comes at you, I think, sometimes.
Okay. That's I had no idea. It was just one of those, to have the kid just in time for the book tour.
Oh,
It
God,
looks like
no.
it was a plan. Oh, good. I'm glad that people don't micromanage and plan as badly as I do.
I know, right?
So where'd journalism start for you? Where'd writing start for you?
I have told stories since I was a little kid. Like, I remember being in the bath telling stories to myself, and I always wanted to write novels when I grew up because they were my escape as a kid. Like, whenever anything was difficult or hard, I always just locked myself away in a room with a book. But it's kind of strange because I kind of went in the opposite direction and dove deep into some of the hardest stories there are. But I think I realized that journalism was one of the ways to get paid to be a writer. And I realized I cared a lot more about social issues and social justice than I realized. And I really love being a journalist. I love writing narrative nonfiction. And then for reading it or writing it, it's this incredible hybrid where you're both getting to tell stories as if they're a novel, but all of it is true. And that, as both a writer and a reader, is so magical to me. Like, you get to be, like, I think Nabokov said, you've got to be both a storyteller, a truth teller, and a third thing, which is an enchanter or an enchantress. And I think narrative nonfiction is like that, where you have to tell the truth, but you also have to enchant the reader and get them into your world. And so that the fact that genre even exists is so endlessly fascinating to me.
I'm so glad you didn't call it creative nonfiction.
I know.
It's a term
sense.
I've always hated. Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being on the same wavelength. What did you have to learn? What did really, I mean, you mentioned the Nabokov edicts, but, in practice, what got easier, or what became I was not doing this when I started out?
Oh, God. I mean, I think like narrative nonfiction is actually kind of ethically dubious because you are relying on people's memories a lot of the time and reconstructing things, and people will tell different versions of stories, and you're hanging out with people for so many years. So are you their friend or are you a journalist? Like, there's so many landmines. So I think I learned a lot along the way about how to navigate different things. Also, when you're interviewing people with trauma, I had to learn a lot about trauma-informed interviewing, where you're actually, interviewing someone in a way that is not re-traumatizing them. And yeah, I mean, just the amount of time spent. I mean, this is not a career for someone who wants to get rich, because I spend all of my money to put it back into my reporting. Anytime I make any money at all, I use it to go buy a plane ticket or spend, thousands of dollars on prison and jail calls that I've had over the years. And pay for public records that I have to request. There's just so many costs to it. So I learned how expensive it was and this is why I think like a lot of long-term journalism doesn't exist, because, it's really it's really costly, and publications don't want to pay for it, and freelance journalists can barely make it. And so, you just have to, if you're doing it, you have to realize like, you're just going to be scraping by. But, I don't know. I guess I learned over time how to make it work, how to constantly have my stories feed into each other so that I could tell the same story, maybe in different mediums, and then afford to make it work.
Which is going to lead to my question of how has journalism changed since you got in? You got in right at the financial crash era, if I remember the introduction, right around 2008 or so.
Yeah.
Which is a period where all the money was disappearing anyway. So.
Oh, God, yeah. And we're at such a crazy time for journalism, because the amount of people I know who have been laid off, the amount of publications that are continuing to close, downsize. I mean, I was just in LA last week and the executive editor of the LA Times left. They laid off a huge amount of the staff. It's kind of a depressing era for media, but I think like the one thing that I am really encouraged by is how many ways there are to tell stories still. It's not like people don't want the media. Like, it's just that I think we have to constantly morph in terms of how we're telling stories. And so like I literally have done in the past year a podcast, a documentary, a book, magazine articles. I think I even wrote a newspaper piece and appeared on TV. And that's not something that I necessarily envisioned myself doing when I was a little kid wanting to be a writer. But the beautiful thing is I got to tell stories in all of those mediums in different ways. And it really challenged me to think about how to tell those stories and how best to tell them. And so people are still really hungry for it. It's just that we don't know how to make money from it anymore when it comes to like traditional newspapers. And so we're going to, I think, continue to see like these crazy layoffs and closures and stuff like that. So
yeah, the long form magazine articles too, which used to be, well, I'm about 15. Well, I'm 53 years old, so a little bit older than you, and have just the great memory of these long articles in Esquire, New Yorker, et cetera. And it's just like,
I know.
Nope, everything is quick now. Which form or platform did you discover that, I actually like doing this when I really didn't think I was going to? You mentioned, podcast, TV appearances, et cetera. And did you figure out what to do with your hands when you were on TV? Because that's always a
I'm so awkward. I mean, I talk with my hands, so it's like way too much. I think it's the Italian in me. But I think podcasts are so, I mean, I'm on a podcast, so, but
different type,
it's a close medium. And I think, in part because it can go anywhere. Like long form magazine pieces, yes, you could be experimental to an extent, but at the end of the day, there was like a certain format to them. And the podcast I worked on, it was called Blind Plea, and it was about a woman who killed her abuser in Alabama. And it was, again, one of these stories that I've been telling for a long time. So I was kind of not looking forward to it. Like, this is going to be more of the same. And it ended up being so fascinating because every episode was about something entirely different. And one of the episodes we thought about structuring it like a fairy tale. And then another one, we were diving into the parole system in Alabama in like a deep investigative way. And then another one was like quite intimate. And I just think the fact that the form is still so, I don't know, open-ended, and people can be so creative with it, and obviously conversational too, like what you're doing. It's a really beautiful form, and I think that's the one that I got the most excited by.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw the piece about your podcast and thought, I should listen to that before we record, but unfortunately I haven't. I'll make sure to plug it when I do the intro for this one. No. Especially right after the Furies, I was like, I just think I need a break right now.
There was just a sense of, it was
wonderful. As I zapped you at the very beginning, before we started, I said I was going to apologize on behalf of all men when we started, and you said this is not a man-hating book. I do want to get that across. At no point does this come off as a book that's, all men are evil, therefore, we women need to X, Y, or Z. Like you say, it's a much more complex story. B, one in which, men are also trapped in certain patterns of behavior that, aren't healthy for anybody, including themselves. But to that end, what was the toughest part of the Furies for you?
Of writing it, or
writing, researching? What was your nadir during all this?
Oh, God.
I assume there's going to be a physical ailment that ties into it based on how you describe that, but
I did actually have like severe stomach issues that some people thought was a parasite that I may have picked up in India or Syria. And I actually thought was maybe just my body revolting against me for all this reporting. And just kind of like the violence, like living in my body. Cause I think we have such a mind body connection in terms of our ailments. I still don't know to this day, but it went away magically eventually after a year. So, and it was when the book was finished. So I don't know if it was like an exorcism or what. I did get very sick in Syria when I was reporting there. I think, the level of preparation I had to do for a lot of this reporting, the level of danger that I had to put myself in. I mean, reporting in Kurdish Syria is not safe. There's drone strikes, there's Turkish, drone strikes all the time. There's ISIS still present, and it's the Syrian civil war is ongoing. And so I think that was definitely one of the tougher parts, is like, I only told my mom I was going to Syria like 3 days before because she would have panicked and stopped me. But it ended up being fine, and I felt relatively safe, being surrounded by hundreds of women with Kalashnikovs who I happened to be in their company. So but yeah, it was a really difficult project, and one that was like, as I was doing it, thinking, why the hell did I get myself into this and decide to write something on 3 different continents or 3 different countries? Like, this was too much. Yeah. But I don't know. I'm glad I did it.
Did you learn to shoot?
I did not learn to shoot. I have shot guns and I don't like it. I did watch them shoot quite a lot, and there was a girl who had a rocket propelled grenade who I took a picture of. That is one of my favorite pictures. And the joy with which she operated that RPG was just something I'll never forget. The joy with which these women would fight, like shoot their Kalashnikovs. I mean, it just was interesting to me. Like, when I shot a gun, I felt kind of like this, I don't know if you've ever shot one, but like, I felt this revulsion from the kickback. Like, I did not like it. I felt like we shouldn't have guns. And these women were quite the opposite. They really it was like freedom to them to shoot their Kalashnikovs,
My embarrassing story is my one time out shooting. I was 13 years old and is in Israel for my bar mitzvah, and my uncle, who was in the Air Force, took me out and gave me a Kalashnikov, a 7.62, and I'm left-handed, so I shot with my left hand, not realizing the cartridges would all eject into my right bicep.
Oh no!
Very, very hot. just the first shot or two, and all of a sudden I'm burned on one side, and the other joke we'll say was that both of his children were deaf, and because of that, it didn't occur to him to give me any ear protection.
Oh no!
The very first moment, I've got a burn on my arm and I can't hear anything. So yeah, it was not a fun experience. Although my father was thinking it was going to be the great, Gil's going to have a big macho thing. I'm like, no, I can't hear anything, and my arm is burned. But yeah, so never went back after. But
That's hilarious.
But it is interesting also just contrasting that with the Alabama chapters, in terms of what firearms mean in America versus what they mean to these Kurds in Syria. That it's we see it as a way of life here, or way of death, and there it's the how do you defend your country or build a country for yourself. Yeah. It's your book is filled with a lot of resonances and a lot of deeper thoughts going on in it. And I was I don't want to say overjoyed. I really appreciated the experience of reading it and everything that continues to echo from it. But tell me, on top of the travel, the preparation, everything else, doing all this during the pandemic, the added strain of that, or was it already?
Yes. Sometimes I forget that even happened. I mean, not that the pandemic happened, but that the reporting was during that. I delayed my trip for a really long time to Syria. I went to India and Alabama largely before the pandemic, and then throughout it. I probably was the most traveled person during the pandemic, and I'm sorry to say that, because that probably is not the good thing. But, I was taking all the additional precautions and protective gear and getting vaccinated and all of that. But it definitely affected the stories. Like the vigilante gang in India, they started enforcing men wearing masks as part of their vigilante activities. But like in Syria, it was interesting. It actually, one of my characters, her father died from COVID, but largely they said like COVID is the least of our concerns. Like, while, the whole rest of the world and, a huge part of the Western world was like, this is the thing that's shaking us to our core. They were just like, this, I'm sorry, but why are you guys?
We got drone strikes to worry about.
We have so many other things going on. So that was interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned on Instagram once your dad's reaction to the painting of Orestes and the Furies. Your folks read your book?
My mom has read it. My dad has started it. He doesn't often finish books, but no, my mom has read it, and she came to my Chicago book event, and I think she wishes I didn't write about such dark material, as probably a lot of parents would wish. I remember even when I was a kid, I would write these like really intense poems, and she'd be like, why can't you write about happier things? But that's just not me. And actually, my dad is also a journalist. He worked in TV, and my first memory is him taking me to a murder scene. And my second memory is him taking me to a family of 10 that died from carbon monoxide poisoning. And I think we're at the morgue or something. So I think there's like a reason for this that is probably going into my trauma and my therapy. But, early formative experiences watching journalists do their thing in dark places. And so I continue to do that myself and, have become less dark. I've learned how to compartmentalize and tell these stories in ways that also don't hopefully bring everyone down as well. I am more interested in telling you the story than making you feel bad about it or something like that. So,
you think things are getting better for women? I prefaced this just with one of our pandemic experiences has been just binging old TV. And Mary Tyler Moore, which is absolutely one of the greatest shows of all time now. But there's an episode of Barney Miller that we watched where a wife accuses her husband of rape. And it's played for laughs, but nervous laughs. And that's like 1978 or so. Now, it would... times have changed significantly, but even then there was a sort of, we're kind of thinking this is funny, but this isn't funny. And now it's whoa, that's really not funny and that's not cool. Do you see things getting better? Changing?
It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, like all social change. But I mean, certainly if you take in America, if I was a 50s housewife, I think I would have been given a lobotomy by now for being too outspoken or refusing to do the housework. But I mean, even if you look all around the world and the places I'm reporting on, I do think like even the stories of women fighting back it's happening in ways that it probably wasn't happening like 50 years ago. Of course, there's stories of women and violent women and women fighting back throughout all of our history and our mythology. And actually, the Kurds argue that we were a matriarchy before we were a patriarchy. And, because we worshipped female, these incredible goddesses across many different cultures. But I don't know. I think it seems to me, as someone who covers this for a living, that there is social progress and that things are opening up for women, but it's so slow. And I don't know, if you take India, for example, the number of women in the workforce in India is actually declining, but the amount of women who are getting educated is increasing. The amount of women who are having affairs is increasing. So there's all these different metrics you could look at, and not that I'm encouraging affairs, but just as like a measure of women having some freedom and agency. Right.
Yeah.
So, who can say for sure, like what in totality, whether things are getting better or worse, but my sense is that they are, and people are continuing to push for change in all of these different ways. And, it's just slow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the vibe that comes off through the book that you cite the one-offs, the bandit queens, et cetera, like the individual stories, but what you seem to get at is the more the bigger societal change, or something that inspires other women not to necessarily pick up a cane and start beating people, but at least to make decisions of their own and ask for more or demand more in their lives. So, but being a white male, I never know how well to gauge that stuff because privilege. That's my blessing and curse, but yeah, it's the book really does seem to get across that sense of no matter how problematic these cases are, there are instances where they're starting to inspire others. The same way Chicha gets inspired seeing the parade when she's too young to join the YPJ, but joins anyway. So,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of us can fight back in our own individual ways. I mean, I think like in a lot of the books, when I've done signings, I just write fight back. And that doesn't mean if someone rapes you, fight back. It means like whatever it is that you want to fight back. If you're like feeling like the world is not going to be habitable in 100 years for your grandchildren, then fight back for that. Like whatever it is, I think I'm very much a person of action and activity. And I just think like, our culture kind of lulls us into complacency a lot of the time. And there's a lot to fight back for. And so if there's anything that I hope comes out of this book, it's that, you know, if I think I end with saying like, if only we could all fight as hard as these women. So we might not always fight perfectly and do it all the way we should, but let's do something. And that's sort of my feeling about all of this.
With or without a rocket-powered grenade. But
exactly.
But it's such an awesome picture you took. But I hate asking this because A, book just came out, B, 5-month-old child. You got plans for what's next?
I actually do have plans for what's next. I
do you
just came to me this week.
Not?
What would you say?
Yeah. Do you want to jinx it or not? You don't have to. You don't have to tell me.
Well, I'm working on a documentary on women who sabotaged a pipeline. So that's fighting back for the environment. And that was for a story I did about 2 women who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline and went on the run from the FBI and eventually were caught. And it's just a wild story. And so we're making a documentary on that. But I'm interested in another book that ties motherhood to protection of the environment, but actually follows the story of one incredible woman who I don't want to say the name of because I don't want anyone else to know about her until I tell
that's
it.
What I figured.
You really know a book is truly done when you're able to even think about another one. And that just happened to me this week. So, your brain finally has space and room for more.
And you're also dealing with, new mom, all the parameters of new mom plus book tour and everything else.
And your brain not totally functioning all of the time.
You can say that, I can't, but
the
baby
fine.
Brain thing. But
it's a real thing. Mom brain is a real thing.
But no, I'm glad you're thinking forward. This sounds like a book that needed, I don't want to say closure because it's a bullshit term, but a book that you sort of needed to put behind you, and seeing it embodied and seeing other people taking it up must be a really great experience for you at this point.
Yeah, it's really cool. I hope it lives on past me. That's what you hope for any book. And I'm excited to continue to see like how people receive it and how even men receive it. Like the 2 of the events that I've done so far have been with guys hosting it. It's really interesting to hear their perspective, interesting to hear your perspective too. So thank you.
Yeah, how have those differed? How have those differed from the women run conversations?
This book, every single person has taken really different things away from the book. So that's been a cool thing. I hope people don't feel like nervous. Like I actually, the event in Chicago, was looking at one of my sister's partners and he looked like he had a smile plastered to his face, but like, don't move a muscle because if I don't move, then no one will notice me. And I think it was like he felt nervous, like I'm in this feminist audience or something like that. But it's just really not that kind of book. I mean, I think everyone's taking something different from it. Like some of the guys who have read it have said they thought a lot about like what constitutes self-defense. Other people have been literally taking it entirely to talk about Palestine. Like it's just people are going in all kinds of ways. My partner, who comes from a Mexican family, has been talking about cultures of honor that he grew up with and machismo culture.
Okay, we had a couple of audio dropouts here. There's connection problems on both our sides. So rather than risk losing more good stuff, we decided to jump to my favorite question. What have you been reading?
I just finished last night on the plane the book Lovesick. I don't know if you've heard of it, by Angeles Mastretta. But it is a book about love and revolution in Mexico, and it is a beautiful novel. So if you haven't read it and you want to be absolutely enchanted, and it's rather sensual too, in all the ways. And I don't know, I love books about revolution that have love stories in them, and it's just the way she writes every sentence it'll cast a spell over you. So I would recommend it.
And previously, last book that just like made you plots and you wanted to give it to everybody you knew?
Plots. I'm just glad to not be reading about violence and women for a while. So, I'm trying to think because I don't think I loved the last two books that I read. I read Crying in H Mart, and that was really helpful for me as a book about grief and food, which I didn't know that such a book existed. But yeah, I think I'll just plug Lovesick for now.
Awesome. The real last question, which came up just because of your writing thing. Still want to write fiction?
I do want to write fiction someday. It's hard with fiction because you have to write a whole book and then they'll decide if they want to buy it. Whereas with nonfiction, you can propose something and they'll tell you yes or no. So I think I'm scared to devote myself to a project that then will not be taken and published. But I certainly have a lot of novels living in my head. So maybe one of these days.
I look forward to it. Might actually see you in New York next week when you're here for the event at
thanks,
in
Gil.
the city. So we'll see. But Liz, thanks so much for coming on and for making this book, which I know cost you a lot financially, spiritually, etc. But I think you brought something amazing into the world. So thank you.
Thanks, Gil. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
And that was Elizabeth Flock. The Furies. It's an important book and a powerful read. And it's so well crafted that you, like me, you may just devour the whole shebang in a couple of sittings. Do yourself a favor. Read this book. It's, like I said earlier on, it's one that I'm sort of proud to bring to you guys, as through the podcast. So go get The Furies, Women, Vengeance, and Justice by Elizabeth Flock. And you can follow Liz and her work at her site, which is lizflock.com, all one word, and on Instagram and I guess Twitter also as Liz Flock, and that is LizFlock. I'll have links to that in the show and episode notes for this one. And thanks again to Lance Richardson for connecting us. Lance and I recorded in 2018, I think, for his biography of Tommy Nutter. And we're planning a follow-up in the fall of 2025 for his upcoming bio of Peter Matheson, which means I need to start reading some Matheson now to prep. Now you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with really interesting conversations with interesting people. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me an email, DM if we're connected on Instagram, postcard, letter, or leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, just call back, leave another message, and let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have some interesting stuff to share with listeners, but I would never do something like that without the speaker's permission, so let me know. If you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, yeah, I've got a Patreon, and yes, the email that I do has a subscription, contribution link to it, but my day job treats me fine. I do pretty well for myself, and this is what I do for love. So really, if you have money to spare or other resources, give them to individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms like that. And you'll find people who need help with making rent or medical bills or veterinary bills or getting an artistic project off the ground. Some publishers will have some interesting crowdfunders where they're trying to get a big project together, but they need the subscriptions and commitments. You can do stuff like that to help people and to bring some culture into the world. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign, make targeted election contributions because I'm a lobbyist and that's part of my day job. But there are other things you can do, freedom funds, Planned Parenthood and women's choice funds, and all sorts of things that if you've got some money, you can help us build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.